We have discussed in our last lesson the 6 major responsibilities of the president. Remember that? And also the qualifications to become president. Today we're going to discuss, starting on page 537, the powers, specific powers and duties of the president. These are really all within those 6 major areas of constitutional responsibility. So if you'll turn to page 537, actually 538, provision number 148 is that the person who is elected president must first what? Take an oath. And provision 148 specifically gives the oath, as does the Constitution, that the president will take. Follow through as I read it. Here's the President of the United States says, I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. What do you think? I mean, to have a president put his hand, usually as he does on the Bible, and raise his right arm to the square and swear or affirm that oath, you would think, wow, we've got a president here who, what? Who knows and understands the Constitution so well that he will preserve, protect, and defend it. How can you take an oath like this if you don't know the Constitution? It'd be pretty tough, wouldn't it? Well, that's what he swears to do. And when Washington first took this oath, he knew that he was not only taking the oath to people, but he was taking an oath to God. And so he added at the end of this phrase, at the end of the oath, so help me God. And that has been repeated by every president since. And where did Washington first take the oath, by the way? At Federal Hall in New York City. Did you see in the first column of page 538 down at the bottom? He added, so help me God. Each president followed this example, and in 1862, what's the time period there? 1862, what was happening? That was the Civil War. By an act of Congress, those words, so help me God, were incorporated into the actual oath that the president takes. Okay? I think it's interesting to talk a little bit about inaugural ceremonies, which is when this oath takes place. Look down at the bottom line of that column, first column on 538. He says, Thomas Jefferson was the first president to be inaugurated in Washington, D.C. Remember, before that, there wasn't any Washington, D.C. This occurred on March the 4th, 1801. The circumstances were not auspicious. John Adams, the previous president, had already packed up and gone home. Where does the previous president usually, where is he usually when the new president takes an oath? Right there. He's usually right there, standing close by. But John Adams had already packed up and left, gone home. There was no parade, no festivity. Have you watched a presidential inauguration? No. It is quite a ceremony nowadays. But when Jefferson took it, there was no parade, no festivities. Jefferson was staying at Conrad's boarding house. On the morning of his inauguration, he took breakfast with the rest of the boarders, just the ones who happened to be staying overnight there. He just goes down to breakfast with the rest of them and sat at the bottom of the table. What does that mean? Kind of the least important place. This is Jefferson. Meaning the least desirable chair, since it was farthest from the fire. This is in March, the beginning of March in Washington. That's pretty cold still. After breakfast, he walked to the Capitol building. Can you imagine Jefferson getting through the breakfast and then just picking up his coat and hat and walking out the door to go to the Capitol building, where the ceremonies took place in the Senate chamber of the partially completed north wing. Approximately 1,000 people crowded into the room. Boy, have things changed. It's a big event when a president is inaugurated, but here's an interesting point. The President of the United States says that he will faithfully execute the office of President. Does that mean that he will carry out a law even if he disagrees with it? Mm-hmm. He's supposed to if it's the law, right? He's supposed to if it's the law. Okay. Provision 149 says that the President of the United States shall be Commander-in-Chief of the military. Is there a certain amount of power there? What does that mean, Commander-in-Chief? Generally, the Commander-in-Chief of the military would be where if the military needs to go into battle?
In the front.
I mean, historically, he would be in the front. He would lead the charge. And this gives him the right to do that. Actually, did you read in your book where they said that the founders wanted to put in the Constitution the prohibition that the president would not go actually out in lead in the military, but they didn't put it in there. Have presidents done that?
Didn't Roosevelt do that?
No, not really. They give orders. And they're in their situation rooms and in their war rooms, and they give orders to the commanders in the field. So that usually, well, that's never happened really, where the president has led the military into battle. President may have certain war powers given to him by Congress, and these war powers are interesting. We've talked about these a little bit in the past over on page 540 in the first column. For example, President Lincoln was authorized to use whatever means necessary to transport war material around the nation. Well, what was the mode of transportation in those days? Railroad. And so the president had Congress's authority to actually confiscate the railroad. Is that something that should be done?
During war.
In wartime? See, in wartime, this is a matter of life and death. This is preservation of the Union you're talking about here. So certain war powers are given to the president during war that would not otherwise be in the power of the president. And also points out President Wilson was given that same power. But what's supposed to happen, as we've mentioned before, when the war is over? All of these war powers supposed to dissipate, supposed to go back, supposed to be absent from the president. And as this says, there have been many times when agencies of government were created during wartime, and certain authority has been taken by the president and by Congress during wartime to win wars, but after the war was over, they go away. And wartime has been an excuse for a lot of things happening that were really violations of the Constitution. Okay, provision 151 says that the president may require reports from his principal officers. Who would they be? That's correct. This is the authority for the president's cabinet. Is the word cabinet used in the Constitution? No. But if you're going to have principal officers, do you remember which ones Washington had? Secretary of, they didn't call it defense, Secretary of War, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Attorney General. Those are the only ones Washington had. But this is the authority of the cabinet. Is the president obligated to take the advice of his cabinet? No, he's not. What if the cabinet completely outvotes the president? Doesn't matter. Where is the executive authority? In the president. Okay? And matter of fact, here's an interesting little Look on page 541, provision 150, down at the bottom of the first column. It says, the President is not compelled to take the advice of his cabinet. On one occasion, when President Lincoln had a particularly difficult decision to make, he studied it out, made up his mind, and presented it to the cabinet. They all vigorously combined to oppose the President. They gave their reasons why he must not take the proposed course, but Lincoln was not impressed with their arguments. When they were through, he took a vote and then said, 7 nays, 1 aye. The ayes have it. Of course, his was the only aye. So, President's not bound to take the advice of the cabinet, but I presume most presidents do most of the time.
What was that vote for?
Well, of course, this was during the Civil War, and President Lincoln was he was opposed by his cabinet and by Congress, even by his vice president in some measures during the Civil War. That was a very lonely position. President Lincoln usually was right in those decisions, even though he stood against his closest advisors. Okay? Not compelled to take their advice. How many cabinet officers do we have today? Did you look on page 554? This thing has grown so incredibly. As a matter of fact, many of the duties that we have asked the President to take, do you remember? Such as being responsible for all the energy resources, being responsible for Social Security, all of these things that we've mentioned that he has no constitutional authority to have, we've gone ahead, Congress has, and established cabinet-level positions for these kinds of things. Just look down here. Department of Interior, this is on page 542, Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Labor, so forth and so on. Department of Energy, Department of Education. Several presidents have actually tried to get rid of some of these departments, knowing that there's no constitutional authority for them.
What happened when they tried that?
But in order to get rid of them, Congress has to repeal the law that made them. And they haven't been able to get Congress to do that. Yes?
What if Congress repealed it?
What's the Department of Interior? Well, the Department of Interior has supervisory control for the national parks, national forests. In other words, the things that are inside the United States. All the grazing, this is a big issue nowadays, the grazing rights that much of the federal land is actually leased out to ranchers for grazing rights. All of that is controlled by the Department of Interior. Okay? You see also on, I just mentioned this on page 543, other White House administrative agencies. The White House office, the National Security Council, budget offices, so forth and so on. Okay, number 151. The President of the United States has the power to grant pardons and reprieves. What's a pardon?
Suspension of sentence.
Correct. A pardon is a suspension of sentence. Do you agree with this? That the President should have this power? If a person is convicted in a court of law, convicted of a crime, should the President, or any governor for that matter, because most governors have this power, should they have that power?
Somebody should have it, and that seems like
I mean, is there any justification for an executive to step between the demands of justice and
Well, it's a check. to
Something
make sure
else.
that they're not
check.
putting
It's
just
also
anyone in
mercy.
jail.
Jenna?
Well, where there's justice, there has to be mercy also.
You're saying that perhaps in some cases mercy would appease the demands of justice? Can you think of a case when that would be? I want you to look on page 545 Here is a quote by Mr. Iredell. Down at the bottom of the first column. You see that? I won't read the whole quote, but that last paragraph there, 545, bottom of first column. He says, "It may happen that many men, upon plausible pretenses, may be seduced into very dangerous measures against their country." What does that mean? Dangerous measures against their country. Even treason, right? "They may aim by an insurrection to redress imaginary grievances, at the same time believing upon false suggestions that their exertions are necessary to save their country from destruction." What's he saying here?
They have the country in heart.
Somebody could actually be deceived in doing something that they believe would save their country eventually, and it would wind up to the destruction of the country. "Upon cool reflection, however, they possibly are convinced of their error, and clearly see through the treachery and villainy of their leaders." In this situation, if the president possessed the power of pardoning, they probably would throw themselves on the equity of the government and the whole body be peaceably broken up. You see that? Somebody gets into a situation where he wouldn't have otherwise done it, and it's pretty clear that he wouldn't have otherwise done it. And thus, at the critical moment, the president might perhaps prevent a civil war. He goes on to say that if there's not the power to pardon, even a person who has made a serious mistake and wouldn't have otherwise done it, you wouldn't have the propensity to turn back and say, "Hey, I really goofed. You know I didn't really mean to do that." Hence the power of pardon. Do you agree with that? Mm-hmm. President hasn't. Now what's a reprieve?
A delay of sentence.
It's a delay of sentence. And the president has the power to delay sentencing, delay the carrying out of a sentence. Perhaps he feels like that there's a possibility that other things might happen to mitigate the sentence. Reprieve is a delay of sentence. Now, when a group of people obtain a pardon from the president or from the governor, what do we call that? That's called amnesty. That's correct. We've seen that happen, haven't we?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in granting the power to pardon, the founders said there is one case that you cannot pardon. President cannot pardon, and that's provision 152. What is it? Why wouldn't you want to give the president the power to pardon impeachment?
He's going to get impeached.
Charges against her.
Because
Okay.
he'll be impeached.
All right, you certainly wouldn't want him to pardon himself or anybody else. This goes back to the history in England, where the king, he granted, remember we talked about this, the impeachment power to Parliament,
But he had a check.
and just when his men were going to get impeached, what would he do?
He pardoned her.
He would pardon them. And the founders said, we'll have none of that. If the Congress wants to impeach an executive officer or a judge, we're not going to let the presidential pardon get in the way. So they wrote right into the Constitution, you cannot pardon an impeachment. Okay? Provision 153 says that the president can make treaties. Well, who do you make treaties with?
Other nations.
Other nations. But it doesn't stop there. The treaty has to have what? 2/3 approval of the Senate. And once a treaty has received 2/3 approval of the Senate, what does it become?
A treaty.
Well, it becomes more than a treaty. It becomes law. It becomes the supreme law of the land. What happens if you want to abrogate the treaty?
Two-thirds of the Senate have to say that it's not.
Does 2/3 of the Senate have to say, we're going
Is that against
to repeal the law?
against 3/4?
How do you repeal any law once it becomes law in the United States? What? What part of Congress?
The House.
How about both houses?
Both houses.
Right? Both houses have to repeal the law, not just the Senate. Once it becomes law of the land, both houses have to repeal it.
Why don't both houses make it?
Why don't both houses make it? That's a good question. Probably because, yes, they do in some cases, as we'll see here in a minute, but probably because the Senate is, remember the responsibilities of the senators to work with foreign nations and so forth. So, and they're supposed to be the wiser, the most mature statesmen. So if the nation as a whole is going to make an agreement with another nation, you'd want the senators involved. Okay? And 2/3 of them to make sure that's really what you want. Okay? There have been some major treaties that were rejected. Remember this? One of them being the what? The League of Nations, which was after World War I, when President Wilson said, we've got to join the League of Nations. And he went stumping around this country trying to get enough votes in the Senate to approve the. What happened? The Senate, in my opinion, wisely rejected the League of Nations. And if you don't have the United States involved in that, what happens to it? It just kind of dissolved. President Wilson never recovered from that defeat and eventually took ill and died. So the Senate rejected the League of Nations, but it came around again when? At the end of World War II. He didn't call it the League of Nations. What did they call it? The United Nations.
And it passed.
And it was approved, but it was kind of an interesting way it was approved. Who was it that led the writing of the League of Nations? We talked about this before. What was his name? Alger Hiss in San Francisco. He kind of spearheaded the writing of it. Then he went to the Senate to spearhead the approval of the Senate, and it was rushed through so rapidly, the record says only 2 senators read it. Guess who voted against it?
The two that read it?
The 2 who read it. And there were many others who said, this is dangerous, don't do this. But, you know, we want to just get along with everybody, and we want to work with everybody. And by that time, Russia was considered one of our allies, and we just got to get together and talk. So only 2 senators had read the treaty, and it passed. And so we are in the United Nations. There's another treaty that we've talked about a little bit that's supposedly going to take effect here at the end of this year. What is it?
Panama Canal.
Panama Canal Treaty. This is an interesting treaty because I want you to look on page 549. This treaty did 2 things, among others. It provided for money to be spent out of the federal treasury, and it gave away territory. Well, remember, money that's spent out of the federal treasury has to have the approval of which house? Matter of fact, it has to originate in that House of Representatives, does it not?
Yes.
Not only do they have to have the House's approval, it has to originate there. So believe it or not, the Panama Canal Treaty. Now, can you imagine the Panama Canal? How much do you think it cost to build that thing? Billions and billions. We are not only turning over the Panama Canal to Panama, supposedly, we are, in this treaty, which was approved during the late 70s, we are paying them $20 billion. That's amazing. Because that's how much we put into it. Or I shouldn't say that's how much supposedly it's worth now. We are paying them to take it. And what are we doing when we give away the Panama Canal Zone?
Giving it to China.
We are giving away federal property. And what does the Constitution require? We haven't gotten there yet, but Article 4, this is on page 549, second column. Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 requires that when the United States wants to dispose of property, it's to be done how?
With the approval of
The approval of both houses of Congress. This is giving away federal property, which Panama, in a treaty, I think it was in 1903, agreed that we would have in perpetuity. That's the word. What does that mean, in perpetuity? Forever. And we are giving away now federal property. And it only had the approval of the Senate. So constitutionally, the Panama Canal Treaty is what?
No.
Is null and void, really. By the way, do you know this? That, and there is a resolution right now in Congress to stop any more giveaway of the Panama Canal, because in order for a treaty to be proper, it has to be approved in the same language by both countries, right? Do you know that's never happened? Our country approved it with the Deaconcini Reservation. We talked about the Conley Reservation, remember, in the UN? This is the Deaconcini resolution. And one of our senators from Arizona said, I think we should approve this, but with a reservation. And he introduced it, and it was approved with his reservation. It got down to Panama, translated into Spanish. Guess what?
They took that out.
Took out the reservation. President Carter told them doesn't mean anything anyway, don't worry about it. This thing has really never been properly ratified. Think it'll go through anyway? Oh yeah. There's a resolution. A number of congressmen have joined and signed, but there's not enough to stop it. So, okay, Panama Canal Treaty. Provision 154 on page 553 says that the President may nominate officers with the approval of the Senate. What kind of officers are we talking about here?
Executive for various different department heads for different.
Okay, ambassadors, public ministers, consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers in the United States not otherwise provided for, which we'll get to in a second. President can nominate. Can he staff his people with just anybody he wants to without anybody's permission? No. It has to have the approval of the Senate. Okay? Which is just a majority vote, right? How about these inferior officers? How about people in the departments? Does the President always have to nominate and appoint those people? And do they always have to have the approval of the Senate? Constitution says no. It actually accepts from this requirement. The President may delegate authority to appoint inferior officers. So you don't burden the President with appointing lower officers, okay? What happens if the Senate isn't in session and an office needs to be filled? Did you read that provision? On page 558, what is it? No, the Senate isn't in session. The President needs an office filled.
He can appoint as he's the leader of the Senate.
Vice President doesn't? No.
He can appoint the person, but as soon as the Senate comes back in session, they have to approve it and they can kick the person out.
That's correct. Provision 156 say the President may temporarily fill those positions. But if the person has not been approved at the end of the next Senate session, what does the person have to do?
Leave.
Has to step down. Okay, provision 157 says that the President will give the State of the Union address. It doesn't actually say State of the Union address. He says he shall from time to time give a report to Congress. 157 on page 559. This is kind of an interesting situation here because, did you read this? Who gave it in person? Washington and Adams. Those two first presidents went to Congress, delivered their State of the Union address. What did Jefferson do?
Send a report.
Look on page 559, first column. Jefferson, however, asked permission to submit his reports in writing because speaking put an uncomfortable strain on his voice. The written message remained the practice of the various presidents until 1913, when President Wilson revived the oral report to Congress. Did you know that? Through actually about half of our history, it wasn't given in person. Why does the president now like to go before Congress? Have you seen a president lately go before Congress and give a... Why does the president like that?
The press and stuff.
I mean, this is the big news. This is the time to get in front of the cameras. This is the time you got everybody there applauding for you forever almost, right? You have to get them to sit down so you can give your speech. And it's kind of nice. Some people probably think so. Okay? So that's what the president does. Washington and Adams gave it in person. As we said, Jefferson began the tradition of submitting it to Congress in writing, and Wilson revived the tradition of doing it in person. What does the president do during his State of the Union address? What kind of things does he recommend? Constitution says he can recommend legislation, which is provision 158. He can recommend legislation. Why is the president the best person to do that?
Because he sees the needs of the whole country.
Right. He sees the needs of the whole country. We mentioned that before. Provision 159 says the president may call the Congress into special session at any time. Why would a president want to do that? First of all, Congress was not meant to be there all year long, right? Just a few months, whatever was necessary, and if something desperately needed to be done, perhaps a declaration of war or something, Congress needs to reassemble. Also, there's an interesting little thing. If Congress, this happens in the state all the time, if a governor, and this is the same way with the president, wants to call a special session, they can specify what the business is that that session will take up, so that the session will only take up what the president says. It's a way of the president focusing the Congress on specific legislation. That happens in state governments also. Let me ask you this. Can a special session be called while Congress is in session?
No.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's a way that an executive has of focusing them on just one issue. And when the special session's over, they go back into the regular session. Okay? Provision 160 says that the president may designate the time of adjournment for Congress. When would that happen? Remember we talked about this?
Neither house can agree on.
Right. When neither house can agree on adjournment, then the president may set the time. Okay? Provision 161 says the president may receive ambassadors. What does that mean?
Somebody comes from another country to...
Since the president has, and it's only the president, has an authority to work with foreign nations, when foreign nations sends a representative of their executive to our country, who do they report to?
The president.
Symbolically to the president. They don't all go to the White House. Many of them do. But they don't all go to the White House and report in to the president. But the president has the authority of the people to receive ambassadors from other countries. It's right in the Constitution. What if a president doesn't want somebody to come over here? What if some ambassador is a criminal or is a spy and the president knows it? How does the president get rid of that person?
Forbid him from...
That's correct. He hands him his passport. And that's the signal in international law. You need to leave the country. Okay? Provision 162 says that the President will faithfully execute federal law. We saw some situations under President Nixon, I think this is in your book, where President Nixon said, I'm not going to spend money for things that the Congress appropriated. Can he do that? Not really. And the court said he couldn't. If Congress appropriates money for specific things, the President has to make sure that the money gets spent for those things. He cannot just withhold money because, according to the Supreme Court, that would be changing the law, and the President can't do that. Okay? Did you know that all military officers are actually public officers, public officials? And what have we said about public officials? They're all to be appointed by the President. So the President commissions all officers of the military. When I was commissioned an officer, a second lieutenant, after going through school, it's the President who does it, but of course he wasn't there, so he sent who? Other people, right? The President doesn't go around commissioning all of them, but it's his authority. All military officers come from the President because the President holds the power of the military. So he commissions all military officers. And the last provision we're going to talk about today is that the President is subject to impeachment. Look on page 563, provision 164. The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be subject to removal from office on impeachment for what?
High crimes.
Treason, bribery, other high crimes, or misdemeanors. Well, what does all that mean?
He breaks the law. Can be held accountable.
Okay? Does it mean that he has to have broken a law to be impeached?
No.
If the Congress feels like that his conduct is not in order, they can impeach him. Let me ask you this. Do you have to prove in a court of law that a person has broken a law in order to impeach them? No. See, we've seen that very same thing happen here in Arizona with one of our governors. He was never convicted in a court of law. But what does that matter? If you have the political votes and the senators say he ought to be impeached and he ought to be convicted, doesn't matter what the evidence is or isn't. Okay? But the President and executive, I should say the executive officers and judicial officers may be booted out. I want you to turn to page 565. Here's an interesting quote, middle of the page, middle of the first column. Mr. Johnston says this: if an officer commits an offense against an individual, he is amenable to the courts of law. What does that mean? If the President or an executive officer commits an act against a person, the person can take him to court, or the law can take him to court and get a conviction, right? And what happens to a public official if a person is convicted of a felony? Do you know this? Automatically removed from office. A conviction. We've seen that, right? Another governor. If he's convicted of a felony, he's automatically removed from office. It doesn't take impeachment, doesn't take anything. That's what our law says. If he commits crimes against the state, he may be indicted and punished. Impeachment only extends to high crimes and misdemeanors in a public office. What do you think that would mean? You think there would ever be a time when a president would be considered kind of above the law, and that it would be difficult to get a conviction in a court of law, maybe because he's appointed the judges? Think that could ever happen?
Yeah.
Yes. And the founders grappled with this problem. How do we get rid of somebody who seems to have everything tied up in his favor, and yet we all know the guy's guilty? Think that could ever happen? Yeah. How do we get rid of him? Founders said, you go through an impeachment process. And it doesn't matter whether he's been convicted of a crime or not, or whether he can even be convicted of a crime or not. If the Congress feels like, by a majority in the House and 2/3 in the Senate, that he ought to be out, the impeachment process will get him out. Does that everybody understand that? And we've seen that happen. And we've seen the Senate, for whatever reason, say, no, I don't think we're going to want to boot him out. Even though what?
They should.
Almost everybody there seemed to know that he was guilty. Anyway, thank you very much.